You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Hello, and welcome to the CEO Perspectives. My name is Dana Peterson, Chief Economist and Center Leader of the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board, and I'm filling in for Steve Odland, our fearless CEO. Today we are talking about the latest report on consumer confidence in the U.S. Joining me is Ataman Ozyildirim, who is the Senior Director of Economics at the Conference Board. Ataman, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Dana. Good to be here speaking with you.
Excellent. So let's just dive in there. So consumer confidence was down for the second consecutive month in February. What is it telling us?
Yes, so consumers have turned more pessimistic in the last 2 months. We had a blip in December, but since then, even though consumers think the present situation in terms of the business outlook and the labor markets is holding up fairly well, they're becoming more pessimistic about their expectations 6 months hence. Whether you look at their expectations for the business conditions or labor market conditions, even their income outlook is starting to take a hit.
Okay, well, let's delve into the present situation first. The unemployment rate is at 3.4%. So that means over 97% of the population has some kind of a job, is working. Do you think that's supporting consumer sentiment right now in the present situation?
Currently, the labor market and the jobs situation is fairly well. As you mentioned, unemployment is at historically low levels. Businesses say that they want to keep hiring, or they are hiring, because we see that in the employment numbers month after month. So specifically based on the strength of the labor market gives a big support to the way that the consumers are viewing the present situation.
And not only are most people working, we have the quitting dynamic. So one of the reasons why people quit is to trade up to a better job. Do you think that that's having any impact on these aggregate levels of confidence?
So people see that there are jobs out there available. They see their neighbors getting hired or switching jobs. And in some cases, they themselves are doing that. And wages are going up. So that is feeding into these dynamics. But at the same time, we're at in a period of high inflation. Even though it seems to be backing off from the peaks, folks are experiencing high prices and prices rising for gas and food items, and that's really taking a bite out of their paychecks. So I think that balances the view of the current environment. Even though there are jobs out there, maybe they feel like their incomes are not keeping pace. So it really is turning towards a more pessimistic outlook when you look 6 months ahead.
Okay, well, let's switch to the expectations index. So that dipped into the 60s, and it's been down for 11 out of the last, it's been below 80 for 11 out of the last 12 months. What does it mean to have a reading that's below 80?
Well, in general, readings below 80 are associated with the economy experiencing a recession, within about 12 months. So those readings are consistent with the economy entering a downturn. And as you mentioned, the expectations index has been below that level of 80 for 11 of the last 12 months. So generally, consumers have been feeling downbeat about the future conditions of the economy, which is yet to play out.
Yeah, and since it's been below 80 for, almost a year now, maybe it's suggesting that really now is the time that we might see, something that may look like a recession or even feel like a recession. So let's talk a little bit about, the jobs picture in terms of how people are feeling right now versus the future. So, for example, the jobs differential or the labor market differential improve. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the proportion of consumers saying that jobs are plentiful went up to 52%. And that's, similar to levels that we're seeing last year in the spring. And that really speaks to the idea that there are jobs out there and firms are hiring and people are getting employed. And again, we're seeing those in the macro numbers as well. So this is not just a fluke of the statistics. So in terms of the present environment, the availability of jobs is still there to support consumers' view of the economic and business conditions. I think they become much more pessimistic when they look ahead and they see prices rising, they see high inflation, and at the same time, interest rates are rising. So that's another factor that really makes consumers more pessimistic about the future. So while they have jobs, they have current incomes, their purchasing power might be getting a dent, and they might be starting to think about spending their money more carefully also. And that's something we started to see in the survey.
And speaking of spending money, when we ask consumers about their plans to spend on big ticket items and even vacations, what were they thinking and what were they saying?
Yeah, especially since interest rates are rising, we have been seeing sort of a softening in the intentions or plans to buy autos as well as homes. And those are very interest rate sensitive spending items. Obviously, they're big ticket items where you have to borrow money. So high interest rates will hurt plans to make those big commitments. But other appliances are also seeing some softening. Obviously, if you're not planning to buy a home, you probably won't be buying appliances or furniture either. So there's a general softening in terms of thinking about making bigger ticket items purchases. In the survey, as you mentioned, we also ask about vacation plans. So we ask about whether folks are planning to take a vacation in the next 6 months. And in that area as well, the vacation intentions also declined in February. I think just the outlook for next 6 months really spells a little bit more softening in terms of spending intentions, in terms of the sentiment about the overall environment, the economic and business environment. And that's starting to be reflected in these spending plans.
Thanks. Well, let's talk about inflation. You mentioned that certainly for consumers, even though they're working, they've seen some wage increases, especially those who have switched jobs. Inflation is eroding their earning power. What did our inflation expectations gauge tell us in February?
Yeah, so inflation is eating into that spending power. The average inflation expectations for the next 12 months actually retreated to 6.3%, down from 6.7% last month. So while that is good news, there is some backing off from the very high levels of inflation. It still remains very high. By historical comparisons, 6.3% is really an inflation level that many or few consumers are used to, let alone remember.
And indeed, inflation expectations, at least our gauge, tends to track what's going on with gasoline and food. And while gasoline prices have been much lower recently than they were over the summer, last summer, food prices are still really elevated. Indeed, every time I think about eating eggs, it's like, do I want to pay all that money for, a boiled egg or for scrambled eggs? So I would imagine that, certainly some of the easing that we're seeing in inflation expectations reflects lower costs for gasoline, but still prices for just about everything else are still very high. And hence that measure is still not back to the lows that we saw pre-pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about the granular data here. So did we see any differentiation in terms of confidence by income group or even by age?
Yes, there are, of course, variations across age groups and across income groups. But we also saw there was kind of a widespread downturn in confidence in February. The decrease in February reflects large drops, especially for households aged 35 to 54. So that's where we saw the largest drops for confidence. And also for households earning $35,000 or more, there were large drops. So that's pretty widespread when you look at that. The expectations, I think, are kind of turning sour across the board.
Wow. Indeed, there's a lot of talk about this potential economic downturn hitting, higher income workers. So I think a lot of that's really a function of the industries that are looking to lay people off. They just tend to be higher wage, like tech and finance, even aspects of real estate. But certainly those businesses are, the ones that did very well during the pandemic, and now they're seeing the other side of that as the demand has shifted away from goods to services. And even among, other places where there are layoffs happening, some of those wages are kind of in the middle class. And even in terms of lower wage places like retail tends to be lower wage, but we're still seeing weakness there. And certainly in motor vehicles, which those wages tend to be middle class wages, we're seeing weakness again because you said people are focused on not purchasing items that have to be financed. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So you did see especially larger drops for the highest income groups. And as you mentioned, that may really be related to those sectors where we're hearing, like the tech sector, about the layoffs. So the future might be most bleak there. But there is, I think, a sense that that might be becoming a little bit more widespread. And I think there are some implications from these observations too, because the spending patterns are likely to be different across different income categories, right? So the lower income ranges would spend, perhaps more of a larger share of their incomes on, food items or gas, commuting, etc. Whereas the higher incomes might be spending in a different mix. And you also mentioned that, the middle incomes might be the ones that are really more thinking about spending on autos or homes. And that's where we're beginning to see this, maybe the first signs that maybe there is a turnaround.
Yeah, so when I look in consumption, certainly the last 2 months of 2022, so November, December, consumption really came off. It was very weak, both for goods and services. And then we saw this big pop in January, which may or may not be sustainable. But on balance, our forecast for consumer spending is zero growth in the first quarter, minus 1.5 in the second quarter, and then plus 0.4 in the third quarter. And then thereafter, minus 0.4 in the third quarter. And then we get back to positive growth at the end. So we're kind of looking at, negative consumption here. Do you think the consumer confidence data supports that outlook that we have?
Right. So especially in this last report, what we're seeing is consistent with what you just said in terms of this, the consumer spending outlook softening and even fall into no growth or negative growth in the near term. I think this may be the first time that we're starting to see consumers' expectation really translating into pulling back on spending. And yes, that's supportive of our forecast so far.
Thanks, Ataman. It's always great to speak with you. So I just want to thank all of our listeners for listening to this episode of CEO Perspectives, where we reviewed the latest on consumer confidence. Just so you know, every week we feature thought leaders who provide insights on the issues of our time. I'm Dana Peterson, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.